Every morning, somewhere in America, a person over 65 opens a cabinet and lines up their medications on the kitchen counter. 4 pills, 5 pills, sometimes 7 or 8. They swallow them one by one with a glass of water, the way they have every morning for years, and somewhere in the back of their mind, not always, not dramatically, but consistently, there is a question that never quite gets asked out loud. Is this really the only way? Is this what the rest of my life looks like? Is there nothing else? I want to talk about that question today, not to dismiss it, not to tell you that the question is naive, or that the answer is simply, yes, this is what it is, take your pills, and move on. I want to talk about it because it deserves a serious answer, and serious answers about this particular subject are harder to find than they should be. Here is what I have learned in 35 years of practice about the relationship between medications, herbal supplements, and the seniors who are trying to navigate both. Most people are getting this wrong in one of two directions, and the direction they get it wrong intends to depend on their personality. The first group hears that certain herbs have evidence behind them and decides, without consulting anyone, to stop taking a prescribed medication and replace it with something they ordered online. They do this quietly, often out of a combination of hope and embarrassment. Hope that it will work, embarrassment about mentioning it to a doctor they expect will dismiss the idea. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens, sometimes something does. The second group believes that anything natural is safe, takes multiple herbal supplements alongside their prescriptions without mentioning it to anyone, and ends up with interactions that nobody in their life is positioned to catch because nobody in their life knows the complete picture of what they're putting in their body. Both groups are trying to do something reasonable. Both groups are creating unnecessary risk by doing it without information. What I want to give you today is the information that sits between those two extremes. Because the truth about herbs and medications in people over 65 is genuinely interesting, genuinely useful, and almost never delivered in a way that respects your intelligence and your right to make informed decisions about your own body. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Robert. Robert was 70 years old, a retired architect from Portland, Oregon, and he was taking 4 medications, one for blood pressure, one for blood sugar. His diabetes was mild, diagnosed 3 years earlier, and managed with a relatively low dose of medication, one for cholesterol, and one for acid reflux that he had been taking for 4 years since a period of significant work stress that was now long past. He was active. He walked every day. His numbers, at his annual physical, were where they needed to be. He was also, every morning, swallowing 4 pills with a glass of water and thinking the question that he never asked his doctor. Robert was not reckless. He was curious and thorough in the way that people who spend decades designing buildings tend to be. He wanted to understand the systems involved before he touched anything. He spent several weeks reading about natural alternatives for blood sugar management before he found what he was looking for. A compound called berberine, extracted from several plants including barberry and golden seal, which had been studied for its effects on blood sugar and which several articles described as producing results comparable to his diabetes medication in certain clinical studies. This was not entirely false. Berberine does have a real body of research behind it, and some of that research is genuinely impressive. The problem was that Robert, like most people reading health articles online, was receiving a summary of the evidence without the context that makes the evidence clinically meaningful. He was being told what berberine can do, without being told under what circumstances, at what dose, in what formulation, for what type of patient, and in combination with what level of medical oversight. He stopped his diabetes medication without telling his doctor. He started berberine in the dose and brand recommended by the article. He monitored his blood sugar at home with a glucose meter he had been using for 3 years and felt cautiously optimistic when his daily reading seemed stable for the first 2 weeks. What he did not know was that his daily glucose readings, a finger stick first thing in the morning and occasionally after meals, were capturing only a narrow window of his blood sugar story. The number that tells the real story of blood sugar management over time is a different measurement entirely, one that reflects the average blood sugar across roughly 3 months by measuring what happens to a specific protein in the red blood cells when they are exposed to elevated glucose over their lifespan. This number is not something you can measure at home. It requires a blood draw at a laboratory. By the time Robert went to see his doctor 6 weeks later for a knee problem, not for diabetes management, this 3-month average measurement had risen significantly from where it had been at his last visit. His blood sugar control had deteriorated in ways that his home monitoring had not captured. He confessed what he had done. His doctor's response was not what Robert expected. He did not dismiss the berberine. He did not lecture Robert about the dangers of self-medication in a way that closed the conversation. He said something that Robert told me later was the first time a physician had responded to his interest in natural alternatives as something worth taking seriously, rather than something to be managed. He said he thought there was real potential in what Robert was trying to do, that the instinct to reduce medication was not unreasonable in his particular case, and that the problem was not the destination, but the method of getting there. He referred Robert to a colleague who had completed additional training in what is called integrative medicine, a field that combines conventional medical training with evidence-based knowledge of complementary approaches, including certain herbal compounds. This physician, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who had been practicing for 22 years, reviewed Robert's complete picture: his baseline blood sugar control, his kidney function, which affects how medications are processed, his other medications, and whether any of them interacted with berberine, the specific formulation and dose of berberine he had been taking, and whether it was clinically appropriate. She told him several things that the online articles had not. She told him that berberine, at the right dose and in a formulation with adequate absorption, does have clinical evidence for modest blood sugar reduction in people with mild type 2 diabetes, the kind of evidence that would not get it approved as a pharmaceutical drug, but that is real enough to be worth considering in the right patient. She told him that the product he had been taking was likely underdosed based on what the research actually used, which is why his blood sugar had been drifting upward. She told him that berberine interacts with his blood pressure medication in ways that require monitoring, because both can lower blood pressure, and the combination can produce drops in pressure that are too significant, particularly when standing up. And she told him that the correct approach, if he wanted to explore reducing his diabetes medication with berberine's support, was not to stop one and start the other, but to do both simultaneously under close monitoring, adjusting doses based on actual measurements rather than hope. Robert agreed. He restarted his diabetes medication at his full dose. He began berberine at the correct clinical dose in a formulation with better absorption under Dr. Okonkwo's supervision. His blood sugar levels were checked every 6 weeks for the first 6 months. At the 4-month mark, his blood sugar control was better than it had been at any point in the 3 years since his diagnosis. Dr. Okonkwo reduced his diabetes medication dose by half. At the 6-month mark, with the lower medication dose and the berberine both in place and his numbers remaining stable, his primary care physician formally acknowledged the reduced dose in his medication record. Robert was taking less of the medication he had wanted to reduce. His numbers were better than before. He was doing this safely, with someone who knew what they were looking at, monitoring the results. He told me he wished the conversation had started 3 years earlier, at his diagnosis, rather than after 6 weeks of going it alone and the deterioration that followed. I want to give you the context that Robert didn't have when he started reading those articles, because there are several natural compounds that have genuine clinical evidence in areas relevant to common conditions in seniors, and you deserve to know what that evidence actually says rather than what a health website's summary of it says. Berberine, which I have already discussed, has the strongest evidence base of any herbal compound for blood sugar management in mild type 2 diabetes. The research suggests it works through several mechanisms that partially overlap with how certain diabetes medications work. It is not a replacement for insulin or for medications in patients with more severe diabetes. It is not appropriate for everyone with type 2 diabetes. But in patients with mild, recently diagnosed, well-controlled diabetes, who are also making lifestyle changes, it is something a knowledgeable physician can discuss as a potential component of a supervised reduction strategy. Magnesium is not an herb, but it belongs in this conversation because it is one of the most commonly deficient minerals in American seniors and one of the most clinically relevant. A significant percentage of people over 65 have magnesium levels below the optimal range, partly because the kidneys become less efficient at retaining it with age, and partly because many commonly prescribed medications, including certain diuretics and medications for acid reflux, deplete it further. Adequate magnesium is involved in blood pressure regulation, blood sugar metabolism, nerve function, muscle function, and sleep quality. In patients whose blood pressure is difficult to control despite medication, checking magnesium levels and correcting a deficiency if present is something that should happen routinely and frequently does not. This is not alternative medicine. This is basic nutritional biochemistry that is underutilized in conventional practice. Artichoke leaf extract has a body of evidence for modest reduction in LDL cholesterol, the type most associated with cardiovascular risk, in patients with mildly elevated levels. Not dramatic reduction, not the reduction achieved by statin medications in patients with significantly elevated cholesterol, or established cardiovascular disease. But in patients whose cholesterol is mildly elevated, who are on a low dose of statin medication, and who are making dietary changes that are also contributing to improvement, it is something a physician with integrative training might consider as part of a supervised strategy. I want to be absolutely clear that I am not suggesting anyone stop their statin medication based on this information. Statins prevent heart attacks and strokes in patients with established cardiovascular disease and significant risk factors, and that benefit is not something to put at risk. But for the patient at the lower end of the risk spectrum, on a low dose primarily for modest elevation, the conversation about whether the statin remains necessary over time is a legitimate conversation. An artichoke leaf extract is one of the tools that might come up in that conversation. Melatonin used at low doses has reasonable evidence for improving sleep onset and reducing nighttime waking in older adults, whose natural melatonin production declines significantly with age. The key word is low. Most melatonin sold in American pharmacies and health food stores is dosed far higher than what the research supports. The research uses doses between a half milligram and 1 milligram, and what is commonly sold is 5 or 10 milligrams. Higher doses do not produce better sleep. They produce morning grogginess, disrupt the body's own melatonin rhythm, and in some patients actually worsen sleep quality over time. If you are using melatonin and taking 5 or 10 milligrams, you may be taking 10 to 20 times the effective dose. Ask your physician about a lower dose formulation. Now, I want to talk about the other side of this because I said at the beginning that people get this wrong in two directions, and I have spent most of the conversation on one of them. The second error, taking herbal supplements alongside prescription medications without telling anyone, is in some ways more dangerous because it is more common and less visible. The story of Margaret and her liver in a previous conversation is the clearest example I can offer of what this looks like when it goes wrong, but there are quieter, less dramatic versions of it happening every day in kitchens across America. The specific combinations I want you to be aware of, because they come up most frequently in seniors, are these: St. John's wort with any antidepressant, any blood thinner, any heart medication, or any medication for a chronic condition. This herb accelerates the processing of so many medications that the list of dangerous combinations is too long to memorize, and the only safe approach is to assume any prescription medication interacts until confirmed otherwise. Ginkgo biloba with blood thinners or with aspirin. Ginkgo has blood-thinning properties of its own, and the combination can produce bleeding risk that neither agent alone would cause. Coenzyme Q10 with blood pressure medications. It can lower blood pressure independently, and the combination can produce pressure drops that are too significant. Valerian root with any sedative medication, any sleep aid, or any medication that affects the central nervous system. The combined sedative effect can be more than intended. I am not telling you these things to frighten you away from supplements. I am telling you these things so that you can have an honest conversation with your physician and pharmacist about everything you take. Everything. The herbal capsule counts. The tea with medicinal claims counts. The powder in the smoothie counts. Your liver does not read labels and does not distinguish between what came from a prescription pad and what came from a health food store shelf. It processes all of it through the same system, and it needs all of the relevant information to do that safely. Here is what I want you to do with everything I have said. If you are taking prescription medications and you have been thinking about whether any of them could be reduced or replaced with something that has a more natural origin, I want you to bring that desire explicitly to your next physician appointment. Not as a question about whether herbs are safe, as a specific request. Tell your doctor you would like a review of your current medications to identify whether any of them are candidates for dose reduction, given your current health status, and whether there are evidence-based complementary approaches that have been studied in combination with conventional treatment for your conditions. If your physician is not familiar with integrative medicine, ask for a referral to someone who is. This specialty exists. These physicians have conventional medical training and additional training in evidence-based complementary approaches. They are not alternative medicine practitioners. They are physicians who have expanded their toolkit. If you are currently taking any herbal supplement alongside prescription medications, and you have not disclosed this to your physician or pharmacist, please do so at your earliest opportunity. Bring the bottles. Bring the labels. Ask specifically whether any of what you are taking interacts with your prescriptions. This conversation could take 10 minutes, and it could be one of the most important 10 minutes you spend in a medical context this year. And if you are in the category of people who stopped a prescription medication and replaced it with an herbal supplement without telling anyone, please call your physician's office this week, not to confess something you did wrong. To give your physician information they need to keep you safe and to potentially help you achieve the goal you were trying to reach through a path that is less risky than the one you found on your own. Robert is doing well. His diabetes numbers have been stable for 14 months on the reduced medication dose. He takes berberine every day along with the lower dose, has his blood sugar measured every 3 months, and sees Dr. Okonkwo twice a year for a review of the complete picture. He still lines up his medications on the kitchen counter every morning. There are fewer of them now than there were 18 months ago. He told me the question he used to ask silently while swallowing the pills, "Is this really the only way?" has a different feeling now. Not because the answer is simple, because for the first time, someone sat across from him and treated it as a question worth answering honestly. That is what you deserve too, not a dismissal of what you're taking. Not a dismissal of what you're curious about. A physician who knows enough about both sides of this to help you find the path between them that is both effective and safe. That path exists. It is not easy to find, and the system does not make it easy to access, but it exists. And the first step toward it is having the conversation. Have the conversation.